Kisavo this week, where we read about the bringing of the Bikurim, the new fruits. Bikurim is the same word as Bechor, the first. Bechor is the firstborn, the first child that opens the womb of the mother. Bikurim are the first fruits that ripen, and this only has relevance to the Shivas Aminim, the 7 species of Eretz Yisrael. One has the obligation to bring Bikurim. This is only if you own land in Israel, as we'll see in a moment, because you bring the fruit from the land that Hashem has given you. Now, when did the obligation Bikurim begin? We find that the mitzvah of challah, that's tithing one's dough, which is the equivalent of truma, giving the Kohen the challah, which is the truma. This is the moment we came into Eretz Yisrael. Truma maser, giving the first tithe and the 10%, this was immediately when we came into Eretz Yisrael. But yet, we'll see in a moment, Bikurim was not when we first came into Eretz Yisrael. It was only after kibush v'chiluk. It's only after we conquered the land and we divided it. Each person knew exactly what his portion was. So you could say very simply, because one has to say, this fruit is from the land that you have given us, given me. And since it hasn't yet been identified which is your land, because it wasn't divided, so therefore the mitzvah Bikurim has no relevance. The expression, the declaration Bikurim, which is an expression of gratitude to Hashem, it's the land that you've given me, this is the produce of the land that you've given me. So it's not possible to say it until you have the conquest and the dividing of the land, as we'll see in a moment. Voyo kisovo l'oretz asher Hashem Elokecha nosin nachlo v'rishto, that means conquering, v'yushavta, and you settle in the land. Rashi, Magid shel nischayv bikurim ad shekov shuas oretz chilkua. We learn from here that they were not obligated to bring the bikurim, the new fruits, until they conquered and they divided the land. And what is the mitzvah bikurim? V'lokachta mireishis kol pri adama. You should take of the first of the fruits of the earth. Asher tovi me'artzcho asher Hashem Elokech nosin loch. That you will bring from your land, which Hashem is giving you, v'samta batena, and you put it in a basket. You will bring it from the land that Hashem is giving you. Now, what is the inference of that? Meaning not from the land that Hashem is not giving you. What does the come to exclude? Is it coming to exclude Chutz La'aretz? I mean, outside of Eretz Yisrael? The mitzvah Bikurim is only, and the Mishnah in Kedushin refers to this as mitzvah tluis b'aretz. The only certain mitzvahs which only have relevance to the land itself, like Truma Maser, tithing the grains, the fruits. It's only the produce of Eretz Yisrael. Produce which is from outside of Eretz Yisrael, one has no obligation to tithe. So Bikurim is the same thing. It's a mitzvah hatluy b'aretz. It's contingent that if it's the produce of the land, if not, you have no obligation. You will bring the first of the fruits from the land that Hashem is giving you. It's an interesting way to say it. You could say from Meretz Canaan, from the land that Hashem is giving you. What is the inference? So the Medrash says, there's an opinion, what about from Ever HaYarden? What about from the Transjordan side? Right? The territory which we conquered from Og and Sichon, which was divided between the 2.5 tribes. It has the status of Eretz Yisrael. What about in regard to the bringing of Bikurim? Truma, Maser, all the other tithes have to be brought. That's considered mitzvah tluis b'aretz. Those are mitzvahs which pertain, that's the land. But what about in regard to Bikurim? So there's an opinion in the Midrash that says no. Ever HaYarden, one does not have an obligation to bring Bikurim. Why? Because the pasuk says, you bring the fruit of the earth from the land that Hashem is giving you. To exclude Ever HaYarden, the Transjordan side, shelokhu mi'atzman. They took that themselves. It was through their own initiative. That's how it came about. Because initially, according to the narrative, they weren't supposed to have it. It's only the last moment they said because they have all the flocks, they need all the grazing lands. That's why they asked to stay there. But initially, it was not meant to be part of the protocol or the equation that we should have Ever Yadim. It's only because they made the request. So because it's not the land that Hashem gave you, but rather they took the initiative themselves, therefore, one doesn't bring Bikurim from Ever Yadim. So the obvious question is, what do you mean they took it themselves? You read the story closely. They initially had said, we want to stay here. So Moshe says to the 2.5 tribes, I have to consult with Hashem. And it was all contingent on the condition they go and they conquer the land with their brothers, and then they're welcome to have it. If not, they cannot have it. So it's only because Hashem allowed it, gave his endorsement, that's why it happened. So what do you mean? The land that Hashem gave us to exclude Ever Yadim, which we took ourselves. They didn't take themselves. They initiated themselves. They initiated, but they didn't take it. So how do we understand the simple understanding? Now, the only Torah obligation, which is explicit in Torah, which is known Hakoras HaTov. Now, the Hebrew language is a very descriptive language. Like in English, unless you know Latin, I'm not sure what the word gratitude means in Latin. We know what the word gratitude means, but what is the root of the word gratitude? But Hebrew is a very descriptive language. The way Hashem created a human being, that if you recognize that you're a beneficiary of another person's kindness, then automatically you naturally reciprocate. If you recognize that you are a beneficiary of goodness of another person, and that's the meaning, Hakoras HaTov. You recognize the goodness. The only mitzvah of Hakoras HaTov, where it's an obligation, is regarding the mitzvah of Bikurim. You have to bring the first fruit, which is the 7 species, and you have to make a declaration, as we'll discuss in a moment. This declaration is an declaration of thanks to Hashem, because we would not exist at all, if not for Hashem's kindness, and we would not have the land, and we would not be able to bring the produce. Now, it's interesting. Why here does Hashem obligate us to be maketova, to declare our gratitude nowhere else? And even within the context of Bikurim, it's only if you bring the produce from Israel proper. But if you bring it from the Transjordan side, because that's lokal mi'atzman, because they initiate themselves, one has no obligation to bring the Bikurim. Why not? As Ayes said, if not for Hashem's endorsing, allowing it, they would have been an Ever Yadim. What do you mean they took themselves? Now, why is Hakoras HaTov, why is it so difficult for a person to be thankful and to show his gratitude? Why is it so difficult? Shlomo says in Mishlei, Eved lo velish malveh. When you borrow from a lender, you become his slave. You're indebted to him. For instance, a person borrows money, you have an obligation to repay the loan to the lender. Let's say there's a question of, there's a dispute of how much is owed. And there's a question, you want to choose a bezdin, a rabbinic court, who's going to adjudicate the case. The lender says, I want this court, and the borrower says, I want this court. Of course, it's easy for me. The borrower says to go to another court, because it's closer to my home. The borrower is bound to go to the court which the lender chooses. Why? Because Eved lo v'lish malveh. Because Shlomo says that when you borrow money, you become indebted to the lender. You become a debtor when you borrow. If a person feels obligated to reciprocate, to show gratitude, in essence, what are you doing? That recognition that you're a beneficiary of another person's kindness, whether it's a gift, whether it's a service, whether it's a friendship, whatever it may be, automatically causes you to be a debtor. You're indebted to that person. A person says, I feel indebted. A human being doesn't want to be a debtor. Therefore, whatever way a person could somehow circumvent that and put it in his own context, that he's not a debtor, he tries to deny that. I'll give you an example. A person works for a company and he's treated well. A person is a quality person. He's appreciative for the employer, the way he treats him, the salary which he receives and the bonus which he gets, which he deserves the bonus. A person, a qualified person says, I'm thankful I have this position. I'm thankful for the company. I'm thankful the way they treat me. I'm thankful for the bonus they give me. That's a quality person. He doesn't have a problem recognizing that, although he's indebted to that employer. A person who's not a quality person, he says, of course, you know why they're paying me well? Because they're getting their money's worth. Why are they giving me the bonus? Because it's an incentive. I should do well for them and even better next time. If a person puts that, what we call spin on it, he's not going to show any, he's not going to have gratitude. Because he is not the recipient, he's the giver. He's entitled. I'm entitled because I offered you a service. That's why I'm receiving. The debtor feels it's true, whatever I'm contributing, but I still feel I'm a beneficiary of the way I'm treated. You didn't have to give me the bonus. You didn't have to give me the position initially. You could have hired someone else. Well, they chose me because I was more qualified for it. You could convince whatever. That's the difference between two individuals. Whether you recognize that you're a beneficiary or you don't want to recognize it. Why is it so difficult to recognize if you're a beneficiary? Because nobody wants to be a debtor whatsoever. The obligation of Bikurim is, Torah obligates you that once a year when the new fruits ripen, you must take those fruits to Shalayim, to the Temple Mount, to the Kohen, and make a declaration which is authored by Hashem, not to leave out a detail of that declaration of gratitude for what Hashem has provided for and done for you. You wouldn't exist, you wouldn't have the land, you would not have the produce. And you're acknowledging that. That's the expression of gratitude. Now, Avar Yardin, it's true, the Transjordan side, if they wouldn't have asked for it, they wouldn't have had it. But you want to know something? And of course, it's Hashem gave it, and because he agreed to give it to them if they would meet the precondition of going and crossing and fighting with their brothers to conquer the land. But gratitude is not a simple, even to recognize it. But if there's any way which naturally the context of the reality makes it that it's not obvious, it's too much a burden. It says, the land that Hashem gave you, but they didn't take it themselves. And every year they took themselves. So of course it's true, Hashem gave it. But in their minds, or anybody's mind, he said, but if they would have asked, would they had it? So because it's not so blatantly clear, and it could be interpreted, it has to do with their initiative. And of course, it's like everything we do. A person should sing God's praises for everything he has. Of course, I wouldn't have done the deal if Hashem didn't want me to do the deal. But of course, it somehow has to do with the person himself. His ability, his contact, his ingenuity, his personality, his charisma, whatever it is, we attribute it to many things. Therefore, despite all that, if you show your gratitude, that's a special quality. But Aver Yadein is the same thing. If they wouldn't have, so therefore, since there's a gray area over here, it's not so blatantly clear, therefore Hashem says, I don't make it incumbent upon you. There's no obligation, you must make the declaration. So I was thinking, we find, Adam Arishon is a question. Hashem said he should not eat of the Eitz Hadas. You could eat from all the fruits of all the trees. This one tree, don't eat. So the question is, and he had a level of clarity which nobody in existence had such a level of clarity. As it says, Robi Sofa Olam Sofo. He saw from one end of the world to the other. And he's in the Gan Eden. And he's a spiritual person. And yet, he chose to eat of the Eitz Hadas. Why? What's the reason? He radiated with the Malachim, had mistaken his radiance to Hashem's radiance. So the Arizal says, the reason why he ate of the Eitz Hadas, this was his justification, because as we say in Pirkei Avos, Lofum Tzara Agra, that based on the difficulty of executing a mitzvah, that will determine the reward. Because the more complicated it is, and despite that, you do it, that shows a greater level of dedication. So Adam, at this point, the discernment between evil and good was obvious. It was easy. He wanted to create a setting where it's complicated. And despite the complication, he will succeed. Lefum Tzar Agra. To show he's a greater servant of Hashem. Okay? So Hashem says, you know something? I'm not asking for heroes. Do it the way I said it. And what is this? From Tzara Agra. If it presents itself, you have no choice. We say Lefum Tzara Agra. But to create it, which goes contrary to the will of Hashem, then of course not. But what was the impetus to this? You know what the impetus was? Even it's me. I created. The reason why there's Lefum Tzara Agra, because I created it. It's my accomplishment. Before it's easy. You're endowed with the clarity. Hashem says, now choose right, don't choose wrong. But now where it's complicated, because I created the complicated, and despite that I succeed, so who's that success attributed to? It's attributed to him. Again, it falls into the problem, the issue, that you don't want to be a debtor. Even though you're doing it for God, I'm not a debtor because it's due to my own initiative. I created it. Therefore, despite that, I succeeded.